So, having insisted for weeks that they had no choice but to stage a strike on Bonfire Night tomorrow, tonight the Fire Brigades Union blinked and called it off. Journalists at the BBC say they're still planning to stay at home tomorrow because of grievances over their pension scheme, and underlying everything, menacing mutters from other parts of the trades union movement that they'll fight the public spending cuts with industrial action. You might think not much has changed from the days when Britain's appalling industrial relations earned us the name the sick man of Europe. Yet so much has changed. Back then, the so-called industrial or labour correspondents were almost household names reporting from some picket line or other. We invited one of them, Nick Jones, who was the BBC's labour correspondent from the 1970s through the Thatcher years, to tell us about those changes.
Strikes were said to be the British disease. They stopped the country, rubbish piled up, and strikes brought down governments. Will unions ever be so powerful again? What was so different about the 1979 winter of discontent and the firefighters' dispute of today was that 30 years ago the council workers could rely on solidarity across the public services. Rolling strikes by refuse collectors, road sweepers, cleaners and water workers and so on closed down public services across the country. Workers could be won over at mass meetings. A union activist like the late Jimmy Reid led the celebrated struggle against the closure of the Upper Clyde shipyards.
The joint shop stewards are utterly unanimous. We're going to fight this. And there will be no hooliganism. There will be no vandalism. There will be no bevying.
Labour were defeated in the 1979 general election, but unions were at the peak of their power. The TUC represented 12 million members, twice that of today, and they were determined to defend jobs and pay. It was here, on these steps to the TUC, that we industrial correspondents used to report on the strikes of the 1970s and 80s, the disputes that halted the railways, stopped the docks, closed the steelworks and shut the pits. Indefinite, all-out strikes, all together, were commonplace then. Now the workers of today are too indebted and too scared to stop work for more than a couple of days. And that's no substitute for the solidarity of the past.
Trade unions remain relatively strong in the public services, in the public sector, but they've failed to crack the private sector, particularly now there are fewer big companies employing tens of thousands of people. There are a lot more individuals in small companies, 1, 2, 3, maybe a dozen people, and they don't feel any solidarity. They're having a bad time, so when there is another group in the workforce which is kicking back against a bad time, they say, well, I'm suffering, why shouldn't you suffer too?
Repeated rail strikes in the early 80s and nationwide disruption played into the hands of Margaret Thatcher.
British trade unions should represent their members. There are 12 million members. I believe we shall have a greater proportion of those voting Conservative than we've ever had before. I believe we shall get a very great deal of cooperation. I believe that many, many members of trade unions will say, thank goodness, someone's prepared to tackle this in a positive way.
Mass redundancies from the breakup of the nationalised industries were eased with big increases in redundancy payments. Unions found it almost impossible to stop workers taking the money.
There is a change in solidarity, which I think really probably started in the 1980s, when employers got much more adept at buying off their workforces. I was involved in the port employers dispute with the dockers in 1989, when the Thatcher government abolished the dock labour scheme, which enshrined jobs for life, effectively. And dockers were one of the most solid groups of people. There weren't many of them left by that stage, but they could still bring the country to a grinding halt. Now, the Thatcher government offered them £35,000 each to take voluntary redundancy. Well, that was quite an incentive, and a lot of them then ignored their union and signed on the dotted line.
With the speeding up of privatisation, national pay rates were undermined. Curbing the union's grip on the electricity industry had been a priority. Millbank used to be the headquarters of the Central Electricity Generating Board. If pay talks broke down, the unions could call out their members in the power stations. And the power blackouts of the 1970s were a testament to their industrial strength. No wonder Margaret Thatcher was so keen on privatising the electricity industry. Breaking up national pay bargaining was as much a target for the Conservatives as ending the monopolies of the old nationalised industries. Even groups of workers as determined as the firefighters can't stage the all-out strikes of the past. Union leaders knew that the two-day strike that's now been called off in London might well have stretched the loyalty of hard-pressed union members and their families.
Most families in Britain now have credit on credit cards that they have to repay every month. They've taken out loans, which they wouldn't have done in the 70s and 80s. So if you're thinking of going on strike, your husband or wife is probably saying, oh, hang on a minute, how are we going to pay these bills at the end of the month? That's quite an incentive.
It's making it very much harder for trade unions to win these battles. Where the trade unions are winning the battles are in areas such as transport with the rail companies, where somebody like Bob Crow, very militant, he'll pull people out. And the reason he can actually win those disputes is he's dealing with private companies which can't afford the financial losses.
Mining communities showed unprecedented loyalty during the pit strike of 1984. But if even the shock troops of the union movement couldn't stop the decimation of the coal industry, the workers of today know solidarity alone is unlikely ever to win the day.
Well, with us now is the author of Why Join a Union, David Seymour. Right, now, David Seymour, from where you look, you've been looking at trade unions in this country for a long time. What has really changed in the way that we think about industrial action?
Well, I think one of the things that's changed mainly is us. And, I mean, this is touched on in a certain amount in Nick Jones's film, is that we've become, even those people who are trade unionists, and remember there's still 6.5 million trade unionists in this country.
That's half what it was.
It's half what it was, but it's actually been going up slightly in the last year or two. But they're consumers more than they are trade unionists. And when we talked in the past about solidarity, people saw themselves as members of communities, whether it was mining communities or steel communities or trade union communities. But now they see themselves as individuals, and they see themselves as individual consumers.
That's the bigger context. There's been a lot of blowhard talk from trade union leaders over the last few weeks, particularly when they see what's contained in the Comprehensive Spending Review. Is what was called a winter of discontent, is anything like that likely in any recognisable form, David Seymour?
No, not in any recognisable form. You've got to remember that that the majority of trade unionists now are white-collar workers, and also that the majority of trade unionists, I think the narrow majority, are women, and they're not. So you're not going to see the sort of scenes that you saw in your film.
Militant women.
Yeah, of course you had. You know, from the Match Girl strike onwards.
Indeed.
But it's not the same thing as. And of course the laws have made a lot of difference as well, but it's not the same thing as the great militant strikes which we all remember really well, of the miners' Orgreave and the year-long miners' strike, and even the Wapping, of course, the Wapping dispute, which was almost like battles. They were battles.
Do you see this?
Well, no, you see, what I remember is that the winter of discontent started about this time in 1978 with the firefighters. They were the ones. You remember how the pickets were out and the braziers were out. It was a lot colder then than it was now. And cars were driving around hooting their horns in solidarity. And then the rest of the winter of discontent followed on from that. Well, you can't now see it. You can't, however, even though there may be 500,000 people losing their jobs in the public sector and another 500,000 in the private sector, you cannot see that whatever happens to the firefighters dispute, you cannot see a similar sort of thing happening nowadays.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.